9 people? That's a lot. It feels like a whole baseball team. When I was young, I always dreamed of having a cute house with a white dog, just like in storybooks. But real life isn't always so nice. I finally got my own house, but when I came back from work, it was full of people, like a dormitory. I'm not happy about it. My name's Mary, and I'm 32 years old. I work in an office. I've been really focused on my job, but lately, all my friends have been getting married one after another. Buying wedding gifts has been expensive. I started feeling like I needed to find someone too, so I started going on dates. Mary, when are you going to give me grandkids? Every time I went home, my dad David would ask this, and it made me really uncomfortable. So, I started visiting less. My mom died when I was young, so I grew up with my dad, my brother, and my grandparents. My brother got married early and lives near our old home. He has 2 daughters, my cute nieces. I already have nieces at my brother's. Isn't that enough? But we always argued about it. Then my dad got in a car accident. When I reached the hospital, he was in bad shape. He passed away quietly while my brother's family and I were there. Dad, I wanted you to meet someone. I had a boyfriend introduced by a friend. He just proposed and we decided to marry. He liked to show off a bit, but he was kind. His name was Richard. Now that both my parents are gone and my brother has his own family, it does feel lonely, doesn't it? I said softly while petting my cat Lucy, just back from the funeral. Mary, you're not alone. You're part of my family now, Richard said, holding my hand gently. He was worried about me and came to check on how I was doing. Let's make a happy home together, I thought. Maybe I could find simple happiness. Little did I know what was coming. Welcome. It's a bit crowded though. I went to Richard's family home for a meeting. Patricia, his mom, was lively and straightforward. I felt a bit nervous walking in, thinking it would just be his parents, but there were lots of people, in-laws, step-grandparents, Richard's brother Charles, his wife Sarah, and their kids Thomas and John. Nice to meet you. That's a big group. The house, built by Richard's dad James, was a bit old and worn, but the family was so welcoming, it calmed my nerves. On the way home in the car, I mentioned how many people there were. Christmas or Thanksgiving must be quite something, I said to Richard, who chuckled in response. It really is crowded. I can't believe they live like this every day. I was genuinely surprised to hear this. Richard's family home was never big, and I thought it was just for gatherings. 8 people in that house, wow, Richard said. Originally, it was just his in-laws and step-grandparents. But then Charles, who couldn't keep a job, moved in with Sarah and their kids without asking. Charles will probably move out once he finds a job, Richard said, laughing. Back then, I thought Richard's family just had some challenges. After we got married, Richard and I, along with our cat Lucy, lived a peaceful life without kids yet. Richard helped around the house, and Lucy liked us. Charles and his family still lived in that crowded house. The walls were covered in children's drawings, and Patricia laughed, saying she stopped trying to clean them long ago. Sarah, Charles's wife, always looked tired. She was older than Charles and close to my age, so we became friends quickly. Hey Sarah, hurry up. Mary, don't just stand there. We're out of beer. Whenever I visited, it felt like Sarah and I were the only ones not sitting down. We were always busy, and I wondered if this was our fate. But the idea of Sarah doing this every day was scary. Sarah worked full-time to make up for Charles, who didn't work much. I was hesitant, but I finally asked, have you thought about leaving him? I've thought about it. It's tough. But we have kids, and he used to be kind, Sarah replied. I couldn't see any good in Charles, but I guess they had their reasons. That's what I thought. Around this time, Richard suggested, how about we build our own house? I was surprised but happy. I've always dreamed of living in a cute house like in storybooks with a white dog in the yard. I had never told anyone, but when I told Richard, he said, that sounds great. We spent our free time visiting model homes, choosing a builder, and a year later, our dream home was ready. We need to keep up with the mortgage, Richard said. Definitely, I replied with a smile. On the first weekend in our new home, Richard's family came over for a housewarming party. Here, Joseph, give them the gift. We're coming in. Oh, what a nice house. Patricia seemed really happy, like it was her own place. I smiled politely. Look, it's a party. Then Joseph handed me 2 cans of beer, like he just bought them. Charles wandered around and found our bedroom, saying, this bed is so comfy. He jumped on it, and the kids joined in, getting excited. Look, there's a cat. They ran around chasing our cat, Lucy. Lucy is friendly, but she's never met so many people at once, so she got scared and hid in the back of the room. Poor Lucy. I looked at Charles and Richard, who were already busy with the party. Mary, Patricia wants appetizers soon. Can I use your kitchen? And sorry about scaring Lucy, Sarah said, feeling bad. Why is someone as nice as her with a guy like that? I care for Sarah like a sister. I'll take care of it, Sarah. You relax, I said, but she still helped with cooking while managing the kids. The step-grandparents were quiet, almost like dolls, not saying much. But they said, "Nice home, right, James?" "Yeah, sorry for the noise," James replied, even though the loud ones were the in-laws. The step-grandparents were the sensible ones in that house. So the odd ones were the in-laws, Charles, and probably my husband Richard too. After that, the in-laws and Charles started coming over almost every weekend. They partied loudly till dawn, and we got complaints from neighbors and even the police. Once Sarah, the step-grandparents, and the kids hadn't visited since the housewarming, but the in-laws put me to work without hesitation. I was really stressed out. Richard also started showing his true colors. Once, when I had a cold and asked him to pick up dinner, he came back with hamburgers. "I can't eat this right now," I said, feeling weak. Instead of getting mad, Richard said, "You need to eat to get better, Mary." What if I had the energy to eat that? I wouldn't have asked for help, I thought to myself. Once, when Richard was sick, I sarcastically asked if he wanted a hamburger. He got upset and said, "No, that's ridiculous." In short, this family was selfish and lacked empathy. They were in for a wake-up call. Enjoy your freedom while you can. You'll get what you deserve, I thought with a wicked smirk. A few days later, I had a business trip planned. "I'm off," I said happily to Richard on the morning of my departure. "Is your trip today?" "Sarah's also away on business," Richard said. "Really? I didn't know. What a coincidence," I replied. "Mom said they'd be in trouble without someone to take care of the house." Richard laughed mockingly, making me think he was being mean. I was busy during my trip. Days went by quickly, and before I knew it, a lot of time had passed. A big typhoon hit, and I contacted Richard. "We're okay, but the family home had some serious leaks," he said. I understood, thinking about their old house. The day I came back home arrived. As I walked from the bus stop, I heard loud laughter in the neighborhood. Is someone having a barbecue? It's so loud. The neighbors will complain. Wait, what? I was shocked. The noise was definitely coming from my house. As I cautiously opened the door, I found bags in the entrance and graffiti on the walls. I was stunned. "Hey, Mary, welcome back," a drunk Richard said. Frustrated, I went to the living room and found drunk in-laws and Charles while Sarah made food in the kitchen. The step-grandparents were quiet and the kids were drawing on the walls. There was also a woman I didn't know. Overwhelmed, I tried to stay calm. "What's going on?" I asked Richard. "Didn't I tell you? The family home had leaks, so they're staying here for a while," Richard said. "Who was away?" The in-laws, Charles and Richard, decided, "Why don't we live here?" Richard proudly suggested. Even with this explanation, I was stunned into silence. "It's okay. We're family. We have extra rooms." "No problem," the in-laws added, smiling. "Don't worry, Mary. The walls got a bit dirty, but it's just kid stuff," Charles said casually. "And who is that woman?" I asked about the woman on the sofa, playing with her phone. "Oh, that's Karen, a friend of me and Sarah," Richard explained. "Yes, that's right," she said with a smile. This girl, Karen, was kicked out by her parents and Richard said she could stay. "Thanks in advance," Karen replied, leaving me utterly confused. In our not-so-big living room, there were 9 adults and 2 children. The room was messy with scribbles on the walls, far from the new house look. The family was loud like a dormitory. I couldn't help but lose my temper. Seriously, 9 people is too many. Are you guys planning to start a baseball team or something? Then I realized something. "Hey, where's Lucy?" I asked, but no one knew where our cat was. Dad opened the window to smoke, and Thomas said Lucy ran away. Charles looked at him angrily. "What were you thinking?" "I told you to be careful with the windows," I said, nearly in tears. Richard, looking annoyed, said, "It's just a cat. We can get another one. If you're unhappy, we can just get divorced," he said with disdain. "You said divorce?" I asked. "Yes, I did. I might not if you apologize," Richard said confidently. "Oh, really? Well, then, here, write this," I said, slamming down the divorce papers I had prepared. My section was already filled out. I got my bags from my room. Why haven't you written it yet? I'm busy, I said coolly to Richard. They were shocked. Angrily, Patricia said, Richard, divorce her already. We've built the house, so she's useless now. Realizing too late. Richard said, you'll regret it. But I had no regrets. You're the one who'll struggle. Just write the papers, I said, taking them and giving some to Charles. He laughed. When did I marry you? Looking at the filled wife's section, Charles said, Hey, Sarah. This is Sarah, coldly. I'm divorcing you right now, Sarah said firmly. Charles exclaimed, Sarah bites the hand that feeds you, huh, Joseph? He was talking nonsense. From my perspective, Sarah had been treated like a servant in her in-laws' house. Charles took most of her earnings, leaving little for living expenses. This allowed Charles to do whatever he wanted, and the woman in front of me was Charles's mistress. Mary, I think my husband is cheating. Sarah had confided in me before we planned our divorces. Sarah endured it for her children, but Charles started selling their belongings. She reached her limit. Sarah told me everything. Furious, we started planning our divorces. Sarah gathered evidence of the affair. Her recent business trip was a lie. We looked for a new place to live halfway. Like me, Sarah had no family to turn to, but a friend offered her a job in another state. It was a good opportunity, and our preparations went smoothly. All that was left was presenting the divorce papers. I want to get out of that hellish house, Sarah said, determined. She had a strong core but had been manipulated by her in-laws. Thinking it would be suspicious to return together, Sarah went back first. She soon contacted me, informing me about the takeover at my house and Charles's mistress moving in. All our actions until then were a performance. Knowing what was happening, I told Sarah, we're not living there anymore. Let the kids draw on the walls all they want. That's what I told her. Charles, thinking he could openly live with his mistress, happily signed the divorce papers. Let's go, Sarah. James and everyone, it's time to leave. The step-grandparents stood up and followed Sarah and her children to the door. Living with people like you, I had given up on life. But Sarah opened my eyes, James said, glaring at the family, and left with his great-grandchildren. The in-laws had been taking money from the step-grandparents' pensions. They were truly awful. Well then, take care, we said as we left. You'll regret this, the family laughed, but we ignored them. Months later, Richard contacted me. Oh, I forgot to block him. I could guess the content of the call, so I answered, Mary, come back. Richard sounded desperate. I barely contained my laughter. Come back, we're strangers now, I replied calmly. Let me talk, Mary. What do you mean? Why aren't you paying the mortgage? Patricia's voice came through, probably snatching the phone from Richard. What are you talking about? I have no idea. I played dumb while Patricia sounded frustrated. Apparently, the mortgage for the house had fallen behind last month. When I pressed Richard, he claimed I hadn't been paying it. What an inconvenience. While I remained silent, Patricia kept talking like a machine gun. First of all, this house, you guys had a combined income of $755,000, right? We could have built a better house. We built this as a new home, but it's not what we expected. Originally, they had planned to take over the house. Sarah had informed me of their discussions. Yes, that's true. But with Richard's $30,000 salary, the bank wouldn't lend us more. If we had taken a joint mortgage, maybe we could have gotten a better house. Hearing this, Richard, you lied. I could hear Richard and Patricia arguing on the phone. I ignored them, ended the call, and finally blocked his number. Richard had a pretentious personality. He always wanted to impress others, especially outside his family. When he suggested building the house, I already had divorce in mind. I told him a friend's husband got a mortgage on his own. How cool is that? I heard these stories like a spell. Richard, wanting to show off, opted for a solo mortgage. I had to hold back my laughter. He probably didn't tell his family because he was afraid of them knowing the truth. But I didn't care. The house was built to Richard's taste. I had no attachment to it anymore. Richard hadn't cheated, but there were no alimony penalties in our divorce. So despite him, I left him with the mortgage debt as my revenge. Let him suffer, and I was able to rescue Sarah, whom I cared for like a sister, from that house. That was my main goal. Later, they couldn't pay the mortgage, and the new house was repossessed. But it was a mess inside, with scribbles everywhere and walls yellowed by cigarette smoke from Charles and his mistress. It didn't look like a recently built house. Richard had to rent a cheap apartment, and Joseph and Patricia ended up moving in with him. They'll probably never leave him alone like parasites. I don't care. They're strangers to me now. The only good thing about my former in-laws was that the children weren't affected. Otherwise, they were the worst. Sarah, as Charles' ex-wife, successfully claimed alimony through a lawyer. She had to borrow money but managed to pay it off. I'm glad for her. Charles and his mistress became outcasts in their community and are now missing. They haven't repaid their debts, confirming how awful they are. Sarah is happily working at her friend's place. Her kids are doing well too. I hope they find happiness this time. James and Barbara seem brighter now, like a weight has been lifted. They sold the old family home and are enjoying their retirement in a distant place with their savings. That's great news. As for me, I've requested a transfer to a local office. I was reunited with Lucy, my cat, thanks to social media. Someone in the neighborhood had found and taken care of her. It's good she's friendly now. I live alone in my late father's house with my brother's approval. I'm saving to build my dream house, and someday I hope to introduce someone special at my father's grave. Today, I'm working hard towards that goal.
A funeral dress with a skirt that's too revealing makes me angry. It seems like you're trying to attract men by wearing it. I'm tired of my husband's unfair thoughts. I want a divorce. I'm leaving this house. My name is Kate, and I'm 40 years old. I love chocolate a lot and often end up eating a whole family-sized bar by myself without realizing it. I used to fight with my sister over chocolate when we were younger. Looking back, I wasn't always a mature big sister, but I've seen adults who act even less mature than I did when I was 25. Back then, I had just married my husband, Kevin, who worked at a bank. We met through a friend and got married after about 6 months of dating. Everyone thought I had a perfect life. But things changed after we got married. Every day, when Kevin came home from work, I would greet him and ask about dinner. If it wasn't ready, he'd get upset. So, I made sure to come home before him, cook dinner, and clean up. It was a bit annoying, but Kevin's good salary allowed us to live in a nice house and have a comfortable life. I thought it was normal to have little arguments in a marriage, so I didn't pay much attention to it. But Kevin's behavior kept getting worse. Despite being married, I still visited my parents often, especially to see my 14-year-old sister who was much younger than me. Since our parents worked a lot, I felt like I raised her most of the time. It wasn't because my parents ignored her, but because I loved her so much and wanted to take care of her. My sister was often sick and had to stay in the hospital. Sometimes the doctors would say she might not make it through the night. Thinking about losing her made me love her even more. That's why even after I got married, I continued to visit my sister when she was out of school. But my husband didn't like it. He would say things like, "Who is more important, me or your sister?" When a woman gets married, she should focus on her husband's family. My mother never acted like this. "You're not doing your duty as a wife." He'd go on like this for almost an hour. None of my friends were married at the time, so when I talked to a senior coworker about my husband, she said, "It's your responsibility. When you're married, you have to prioritize your husband." I thought that's how it was supposed to be. Looking back, I realized I was naive. But even then, I couldn't imagine not seeing my sister. My sister's health was getting worse, and she was in the hospital again, only allowed short visits in a sterile room. It's natural for a family to want to be together in times like these. Sometimes, I'd even take a day off from work to go see her, and I started going to the hospital even on days when my husband was off. But my husband strongly disagreed with this. One day, out of the blue, he invited his mother, my mother-in-law, over to our house. With her there, he confronted me. "What are you even thinking? I work hard to take care of our home, and you can't even do that properly. You're just hopeless. I've told you so many times not to wear skirts, yet you still do. It's inappropriate for a married woman to wear a skirt. What's the problem with me wearing the clothes I like? And this dress was chosen by my sister. I can't just give up on it." "See, there you go again. Always bringing up your sister, Kate. You should be caring more about me. After all, who do you think supports you? Hey, I work too. You can't just claim you're the only one providing." This argument isn't getting us anywhere. "Listen, I've already called your workplace and told them you're quitting. You should be thankful. From now on, your focus will be on taking care of the house." "What are you talking about? You can't make decisions like this without asking me first. I'm not going to listen to you. Starting today, you're going to live with my mom. Maybe then you'll learn how to be a proper wife." I don't understand what's gotten into you. You're acting irrationally. Shut up. The angry husband smashed a glass on the floor and continued to throw things around in his rage. Seeing the broken glass made me truly scared of my husband for the first time. I regretted marrying him, wondering how I ended up with someone like him. Later, I tried to cancel my resignation with my company, but they told me not to cause any trouble. It turned out my husband had demanded my resignation in a way that was almost abusive, so I lost my job and had to stay at home as my husband wanted. When I told him I quit my job as he wished, he apologized with a smile, saying he might have gone too far. But after seeing his true nature, I couldn't trust his apology. The next day, my husband surprised me by bringing home a group of his coworkers. He proudly introduced me, saying, "I wanted to show off my lovely wife," and his colleagues joined in, praising my appearance. Then, out of the blue, he declared, "My wife is an amazing cook. You have to taste her food before you leave." I panicked, realizing we didn't have enough food for everyone. "It's fine, just make something simple." "I don't want you to stress out," he reassured me. "I can go shopping if we need more ingredients," one of his female coworkers offered. "Your husband really cares about you. I'm jealous," he added. "No, he's just good at putting on a show. If he really cared, he wouldn't have brought his coworkers home after a big fight yesterday." I thought bitterly to myself as I started cooking with my mother-in-law. After about 3 hours of eating and drinking, his coworkers finally left. "Hi, you." "What?" I instinctively replied, feeling nervous about what might happen next, given his grumpy mood. I was anxious, afraid he might explode like the day before. "Can't you be a bit happier? Seems like I'm not teaching my wife properly," he criticized. I couldn't understand what I did wrong, but I didn't dare to argue. I was too scared. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, feeling defeated. "Even a child can apologize," he scoffed. "Mom, give her a score for today." He turned to his mother for backup. "Well, she's not doing a good job supporting her husband, is she?" "I can't give her any score," his mother replied. "Haha, see, even my mom agrees. She can't even give you a score. How funny is that?" My husband laughed and lightly tapped me. "And about the meal, I tasted a bit. But didn't Kevin find it unsatisfactory?" he continued. "That's right, Mom. Keep it coming. And what about her clothes? There were men among the colleagues, but she's showing too much skin. What do you think? As a woman, it's indecent to expose your collarbone. She should cover it with a scarf or turtleneck," he added. Whose fault is it that his colleagues suddenly invaded our house and I had to cook without even having time to change my clothes? I retorted. "It's Kevin's," I concluded. I couldn't understand why I was constantly being criticized so harshly. She really is something, isn't she? Despite my efforts to teach her every day, she just doesn't seem to learn. "Maybe she's just not very smart," my husband remarked. "No doubt about it," his mother agreed. That day, I endured a lecture for nearly 2 hours. By the time I finally got a chance to take a bath and go to sleep, it was almost 4 a.m. I had to wake up soon to prepare my husband's lunchbox, so I decided to skip sleep altogether. Despite everything, my husband continued to try to teach me a lesson, especially when I kept visiting my younger sister. About a month and a half later, I received the heartbreaking news of my sister's passing. "I wished it was a lie," I murmured, desperately hoping that my mother's announcement of my sister's passing was just a cruel joke. I had been warned countless times about my sister's critical condition, and I had even shared what I thought would be my last moments with her. I thought I was prepared, but my heart couldn't accept the reality. She was only 14 years old. I questioned whether my sister, who endured painful treatments and constant hospital stays, had truly found happiness in her life. As her older sister, I had been able to bring her joy. However, the last expression I saw on her face in the hospital was a smile. It seemed she hadn't suffered. "You fought bravely and you did your best. Thank you for everything," I whispered through tears as I hugged my sister and bid her a final farewell. The funeral passed in a blur, and I realized I hadn't been home for several days. I informed my husband about my sister's passing, but as expected, he didn't bother to attend the funeral. Instead, he said something hurtful like, "You should prioritize me over the dead." Unable to bear such cruel words at such a time of grief, I ignored him and hung up the phone. When I finally returned home, weighed down by sorrow, my husband and mother-in-law were waiting for me at the door, looking stern and unwelcoming. "You're quite late, aren't you?" my husband remarked. A family member has passed away. I couldn't just come back in a few hours. How can you accuse me of lying so easily? I replied, feeling hurt and frustrated. What? Are you going through a rebellious phase? Always lying and defying me. Whose wife do you think you are? He retorted. Wait a minute, my sister really did die. It's not a lie, I insisted. I wonder. Even though you haven't greeted me at the door in days, even if you're wearing a skirted suit now, it's hard to believe you, he replied dismissively. Why is it hard to believe? I asked, confused and upset. If you truly love your husband, you should be able to do it. It's your duty as a wife to welcome your husband home. My husband scolded me, accusing me of being incompetent, and don't even think about denying it. Are you having an affair? What? No matter how many times I tell you, he dressed provocatively, and the other day you were flirting with my colleague. You're just interested in other men, aren't you? What a disgraceful woman, he continued, hurling hurtful accusations at me. What the heck? I started to argue back, fueled by anger and forgetting my fear of my husband. But then it happened. Divorce, huh? Fine by me. Someone as frivolous as Kate isn't fit for Kevin, right? My mother-in-law chimed in. My husband mumbled, trying to stop her, but I seized the opportunity. I agree with Mom. Let's get a divorce, I declared firmly. My husband kept pleading with me to reconsider, but I had made up my mind. I couldn't risk staying with him any longer, afraid that his violence might escalate. This was my chance, and I was certain it was the right time to end our marriage. So I quickly packed my things and left the house. My husband kept insisting, if you apologize, I'll forgive you. But I ignored him, thinking he must be delusional. He persisted until the end, grabbing my arm tightly and saying, wait. But I reacted instinctively, hitting him in the face with my bag and running away. I headed straight for a specific place, a room in an apartment that I had prepared just in case something like this happened. As soon as I entered the room, I received a call from my mother-in-law on my cell phone. Hello. Kate, did you arrive safely? She asked concernedly. Yes, I'm fine. I'm in a taxi, so Kevin won't find out, I reassured her. That's good. Make sure to hire a lawyer and proceed with the divorce quickly, she advised. Yes, I can't wait to start living independently, I replied. In reality, my mother-in-law and I had been pretending to be at odds in front of my husband. It all began the day my husband brought a colleague home. After his lecture ended and my husband fell asleep, my mother-in-law approached me. Leave this house. Get away from my son, she urged me. Each time my husband criticized me, my mother-in-law, who seemed to have her suspicions, would ask, Really? It turned out her late husband had been very much like my husband, and she had endured a lot in her own marriage. In her generation, divorce was frowned upon, so she couldn't end her own marriage. But it seems she wanted something better for me. Watching the interactions between my husband and me, she must have felt compelled to help me. That's when my mother-in-law, with the help of a friend, found a safe place for me to live alone. It's hard to believe she's related to my husband. I can't thank her enough for her kindness. After living in the apartment she arranged for me for 2 weeks, my mother-in-law finally visited, pulling along a suitcase. Welcome. I'm looking forward to this new chapter, she greeted me warmly. Living with us, my mother-in-law discovered that her own son had changed. Before, he seemed like a good person, the image he presented to his colleagues. My mother-in-law blamed herself, believing that his behavior was influenced by his father's genes or things he witnessed during his childhood. For me, regardless of the reasons behind his behavior, I believe the real issue lies in his inability as an adult to control his emotions. So I don't hold my mother-in-law responsible. My husband now takes good care of my mother-in-law, but only because he thinks she's on his side. I fear what he might do if he discovers she's been helping me with the divorce. That's why I suggested she come live with me for a while when she prepared this house. At first, she hesitated, worrying that once my husband and I divorce, she'd become a stranger to me. But I assured her, saying, after everything you've done for me, there's no daughter-in-law distinction. You're like my mother or my sister. That's how I see you. On the way back from my sister's funeral, my mother-in-law steered the conversation toward divorce, intentionally supporting me. Recognizing her intentions, I quickly agreed to the divorce. I thought it would take more time and preparation to leave my husband, but thanks to my mother-in-law's help, that time came sooner than expected. I have nothing but gratitude for her. Finally, the divorce was officially settled through the lawyer. 4 days later, as I returned to the apartment, I was startled to find my ex-husband waiting for me outside. "I found you. You're trying to trick me," he accused loudly. Does he know about what happened? I wondered silently, trying to remain composed. "What do you want now?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "It's your fault that the credit card and bank account balances have decreased," he blamed me. "What are you talking about?" "I don't understand," I replied, feigning innocence. In truth, before the divorce, I was using my husband's credit card to gradually buy furniture for this house. I also quietly withdrew money from the bank account. It was all part of my plan, I confessed. When I discussed this with my mother-in-law, she encouraged me to go ahead with it, so I emptied the account without any hesitation. The reason why my unemployed mother-in-law and I can live comfortably, enjoying tea parties every night, is because of this money. That's my money. "You can't just do whatever you want without facing the consequences," he shouted angrily. "Remember the money we have? It's from the credit card we got after we got married and the money we saved together. Since we're married, it's both of ours," I explained, smiling at him. Suddenly, my mother-in-law returns from shopping and says, "Oh, you found out, didn't you?" Surprised, my ex-husband stands speechless behind me. "Hey, you're back," I greet my mother-in-law, trying to keep things normal. "What? Why is Mom here?" my husband asks, confused. "Well, because we're living together," I respond, with my husband still puzzled and my mother-in-law acting like it's no big deal. "So, you lied about going back to your parents' house, and why are you living with Kate, not me?" he questions. "I'm lost," Kevin admits. "Well, I've lost hope in you, Kevin," his mother replies. "What? But I'm the one who helped Kate get away," Kevin protests. "Actually, Kevin, Kate and I had already planned to split up before you even knew about it," his mother reveals. "But Mom, you were saying terrible things about Kate." "Yes, well, when I was criticizing her, I was really imagining you in her place," his mother confesses. "What do you mean?" Kevin asks, confused. "Because you're not the sharpest tool in the shed, and you get all worked up over silly things like a woman showing her collarbone. I was worried Kate would be in trouble. She deserves someone better than you for a husband," Kevin's mother bluntly tells him. Kevin is taken aback by his mother's harsh words. Meanwhile, I find her response so unexpectedly funny that I burst into laughter. "Mom, you do realize I'm your son, don't you?" Kevin asks, trying to make sense of it. "Unfortunately, yes." "I guess I should have raised you differently," his mother responds dryly. I can't help it, and my laughter grows even louder. "You're just a chit off the old block, like your dad. Watching you mistreat Kate reminded me of my own past. I worried that if she left you, you'd come crawling back to me. I couldn't take that chance, so I left you and moved in with Kate, for both our sakes," Kevin's mother explains. Kevin's mother's confession brings tears to his eyes. He finally explodes. "Is it my fault? Why? You're my child. You've been neglecting me." His mother laughs, almost incredulously. "Do I still need to mother a grown man who's almost 30, she scoffs. A few neighbors gathered as our argument escalated in the yard. They chuckled at my ex-husband's dramatic outburst, saying, "He's really making a scene." With people watching, he didn't dare lay a hand on us and retreated to his house. But the next day, he seemed to have completely lost it. He started spreading rumors about us to his friends and co-workers who used to hang out at our place. My ex may seem nice, but she ignores her husband, he complained to anyone who would listen. One woman at his office fired back, "You know, your behavior is exactly why women are wary of their husbands. It's becoming a societal problem." Although no one openly agreed, the vibe at work made it clear that Kevin was in the wrong, and he felt increasingly isolated. In the end, my ex-husband, who turned out to be quite sensitive, couldn't handle the judgmental stares and whispers anymore. He quickly quit his job. It's ironic how he was so quick to criticize me but couldn't handle criticism himself. How sad. Feeling alone, he sent me a lengthy letter trying to justify his behavior and boasting about his greatness as a man. The letter was a whopping 10 pages long. I was surprised when I received the thick envelope. I had blocked his texts, but if he could write this much by hand, I can only imagine how many texts he would have sent. His final line was, "If you ever miss me, feel free to contact me." So I playfully replied, "Then please go ahead with the property division." That sparked another big argument. I used to be afraid when we lived together, but not anymore. I stood my ground with my lawyer. Even before his mother suggested I leave, I had secretly been recording his behavior at home, preparing for a divorce. All those months enduring his hurtful words paid off. With the evidence, I successfully sorted out the property division. After that, I moved out from living with my ex-mother-in-law when I found a new job. It was still close enough for a reasonable commute. Surprisingly, she had found herself a boyfriend. It turned out the person who introduced us to the apartment was her new beau. She left with him, holding hands, and said, "Come visit us once we're settled." I must admit, my ex-mother-in-law really surprised me. She's a fantastic woman, and it's clear why she's so well liked, regardless of her age. As for me, I spent my best years focused on work after changing careers, thinking I might have missed my chance for remarriage. However, I started joining regular online gatherings with my colleagues. This gave me more opportunities to casually exchange contact info with people I didn't usually talk to, including a director from another department who showed interest in me. At first, I kept my distance because we worked for the same company. But as we began having private online chats about things we couldn't discuss at work, we grew closer and eventually started dating. The head of the department, who hadn't been in a relationship for years since his last girlfriend left him because of his workaholic tendencies, treated me with caution, saying, "I don't want to repeat the same mistake." And happily, we decided to tie the knot next year. I was concerned that his parents might not approve of me, considering I've been divorced before and he's getting married for the first time. However, I'm relieved to see his parents are accepting and even grateful, saying, "Thank you for being with our son." When I shared the news of my upcoming marriage with my ex-mother-in-law, she was genuinely happy for me. Oh, and about my ex-husband, it seems he found a job at a different bank and got remarried. But knowing his personality, it's likely he's been divorced again. That makes it 3 divorces now. He works at a bank and initially comes off as charming, but he tends to blame his ex-wives for the divorces, which makes it seem like women fall for him. Even when my ex-mother-in-law tries to warn women about his true nature at wedding receptions, he manages to manipulate them skillfully. Well, after 3 divorces, it's likely he'll start being avoided by women. I just hope there won't be any more victims. With the way he's going, he probably won't have a good ending because he's likely disliked by many women. But honestly, it's not my concern anymore. Guess what it's like to travel abroad with my husband's money, my sister-in-law Betty boasted. "I wonder how it feels to rely not only on your parents but also on your brother," she added, sounding a bit rude. I felt really angry at her boldness. "Well, you're not any better. You stay at home all day but still hire a maid and don't do any chores," I snapped back. "That's enough, both of you, stop it," my father interrupted as our argument started to get out of hand. He calmed me down with a gentle look and then turned to Betty. "It seems like you both can't enjoy your trip with us here. We'll head back home. Sorry for disturbing," he said politely. "My name is Lisa. I'm almost 40 years old and I work while living with my father. My mom passed away from an illness 10 years ago, and my younger brother Jake, who is 5 years younger than me, has already gotten married and moved out. I live simply with my father in our bay house. It's not that I can't afford to live on my own. I choose to live with my father because I worry about him. After my mom died, he started having a lot of health problems and had to stop working as he got closer to retirement age. His health got worse to the point where he wouldn't eat for days unless reminded and would be stuck in bed for almost 2 weeks if he got sick. I couldn't leave my dad alone in that condition. At that time, my brother Jake was already working as a lawyer and was engaged to be married. Jake and his fiancée were planning to build a new home near ours, so it was obvious that I would continue living with my father. Jake is very talented compared to me. I never expected his wife to be so difficult. Jake's wife, Betty, stopped working as soon as they got married and became a homemaker. She doesn't do any chores herself and relies on a hired butler. Her days mostly involve fancy lunches and shopping at expensive stores. Jake is busy with his job, so he might not have much time to spend with Betty, but her extravagant lifestyle is surprising. Living near Jake and Betty's house, I couldn't help but hear about Betty's carefree life. What made it worse were her comments when she visited us. "When are you going to move out, Lisa? Aren't you embarrassed to still live at home at your age?" She teased me. I often bit my tongue and just smiled vaguely, not wanting to hear such words from a woman who doesn't do any housework and just enjoys herself. I wish she wouldn't come over at all, I thought to myself. But my father felt sorry for Betty, thinking Jake might be too busy and she might feel lonely. He didn't push her away. Instead, he often invited her to have dinner with us. I wish Jake and my father could understand how much Betty's behavior was affecting me emotionally. But when I saw my father, unaffected by Betty's bold attitude, happily eating dinner with her, I couldn't help but feel like as long as he was happy, that was all that mattered. Why did Jake marry someone like her? I often wondered about it, but I figured there must be qualities in Betty that only Jake could appreciate. I chose to ignore Betty's rude comments and quietly continued eating. That day, like usual, my father invited Betty to join us for dinner. Jake had been really busy with work lately, and Betty usually just helped herself to food prepared by the housekeeper. Maybe feeling sorry for Betty, my father decided to buy some fancy ingredients and suggested that the three of us have a nice meal together. I wasn't very excited about it, but since my father insisted, I didn't have much of a choice. I went to the supermarket in town and bought some ingredients, then managed to make some dishes I'd never tried before. My father, who hadn't been eating much lately, was really happy and joked, saying, "I'm extra hungry today." Betty showed up quite a bit later than we agreed and plopped down in a dining chair without even saying hello properly. The dishes I'd made were all laid out in front of her. "Now that we're all here, let's dig in," my father said cheerfully, but Betty didn't seem happy. She pushed the food around with her fork, let out a big sigh, and said, "Do you really expect me to eat something that looks this unappetizing?" Betty shot me a disdainful look as she glanced at the dishes. I stared back at her, then turned to my father in surprise. He also seemed taken aback, his mouth hanging open as he looked at Betty. "Well, it might not be as fancy as what your housekeeper prepares, but Lisa made all of this herself. Can't you show a bit more respect?" My father responded sternly. Betty immediately frowned. "I never said I wanted to eat with you guys. I'm just trying to create some memories here, and you serve me something that looks so unappealing. Can't you think about how I feel?" "What do you mean by making memories?" I muttered under my breath, but Betty caught on quickly. She looked down at me and my father, smirked, and said something shocking. "Well, your father won't be around for much longer, will he? I'm the devoted daughter-in-law keeping him company." So, I was expecting a sizable inheritance. At that moment, both my father and I were stunned into silence. The room fell quiet. Could this really be the woman that the smart Jake chose to marry? Talking about inheritance before someone has even passed away. There's something really wrong with that. "You're going to live for many more years." Before I knew it, I was shouting. Even Betty, who had been grumpily playing with her food, stopped when she saw me venting my anger. "Don't talk about inheritance to my dad. He might just be another person to you, but he's family to me. He's also family to Jake. He's the only living relative left for us after we lost our mother." My father gently restrained me as I leaned over the table, breathing heavily. I slowly sat back down, my anger toward Betty still burning inside. With a deep breath that seemed to break the tension, I felt my pent-up emotions deflate. "I'll pretend I didn't hear what you just said," my father said in a calm voice. Immediately, Betty scoffed. "All I did was speak the truth. I don't want the inheritance to go to a woman who's still living with her parents." Betty's words were blunt. I didn't have the energy to be angry anymore. She boldly brought up what my father had tried to ignore and hurled her insulting words and actions at us. "I'll leave this old house to you, sister-in-law. Looks like you won't have to worry about losing your place to live," Betty said with a mocking laugh. I wanted to argue back, but when I saw my father quietly shaking his head, I held my tongue. My father was too forgiving with Betty, even as she feels lonely because Jake is often busy with work. It's not right to excuse an adult who doesn't know how to speak respectfully. My father glanced at my expression and murmured softly, "She's the one Jake picked." There was a sad smile on my father's face. He looked like a dad dealing with a troublesome daughter and also like a man who's been worn down by life. I couldn't bring myself to say anything when I saw my father's expression. I had words for both my father and Betty, but more than anything, I wanted to know what Jake thought about all of this. It's uncertain if Jake knows about Betty's behavior. If he's aware of it and ignoring it, then I feel obligated to speak up as his sister. In the end, Betty hardly ate the food I cooked and left early after a short conversation. Only my father and I remained in the spacious living room. Making memories, huh? Maybe she's onto something, I sighed quietly, noticing my father's figure suddenly appearing smaller as he muttered those words. Following Jake's suggestion, our family decided to take a trip to France. My father wanted to visit France while he could still walk without assistance, so Jake and I organized the trip. Initially, I suggested to Jake that he and Dad go on the trip alone without me, since Betty often made snide remarks toward me. I didn't want to spoil the happy atmosphere of the trip. However, Jake insisted that it would be better to have someone who usually observes Dad's condition, so he ended up buying 4 tickets. I reluctantly agreed to join them on the trip to France, and as I anticipated, Betty was in a sour mood the entire time, not speaking a word to anyone on the plane. Once we arrived, we headed straight to the heart of Paris and enjoyed sightseeing. My father was surprisingly lively, exploring every corner with enthusiasm. Betty seemed to brighten up a bit when Jake bought her a designer bag. She walked arm in arm with Jake, but I couldn't help but notice that Jake didn't seem particularly happy at that moment. I accidentally locked eyes with Betty, and she glared at me so intensely that my heart skipped a beat. By the way, why is Lisa even here with us? Betty let go of Jake's arm and confronted me. I asked her to come just in case something happens to Dad. We need someone who can handle it. Jake tried to intervene, but it seemed like his words didn't register with Betty. She continued to stare at me, smirking. Betty spoke in a mean way, asking what it's like to use her husband's money to travel abroad. She said not to spend too much because plane tickets are expensive. Then she rudely suggested that Lisa could sleep outside instead of in a fancy hotel suite. Jake tried to stop her, but she didn't listen. Betty insulted Lisa, saying she lives off her family's money, including her brother's. Lisa felt really angry and upset at this. She fired back, saying Betty actually lives off Jake's money even though she's a housewife. Lisa pointed out that Betty hires someone else to do the housework. Their dad stepped in before things got worse. He calmly told Betty they'd leave because their presence was ruining her trip. He apologized to Lisa and asked her to check the bus schedule to the airport. Betty looked pleased, but Jake seemed worried. Jake suddenly realized that they would be left without anyone to help them once their parents left. He desperately tried to stop them from leaving, but their dad remained firm in his decision. He asked Lisa to check the bus schedule to the airport and promptly headed in that direction. Lisa had to follow her dad while keeping an eye on her brother and his wife. As they walked away, Jake shouted that they would be fine without their parents, disrespectfully calling them old man and old lady. Lisa felt upset at Betty for calling their dad old, but she didn't dwell on it. She hurried after her dad, listening to Jake's distressed cries and Betty's insults directed at him. Eventually, Jake burst into the cafe near the airport where they were having tea, looking frantic and sweaty. He rushed to their table and bowed his head in a flurry of panic. "I'm really sorry for what happened earlier. I'll make a proper apology later, but right now, I need your help with Betty," Jake said earnestly, bowing deeply. Dad and I exchanged surprised looks. "What happened to Betty?" I asked on behalf of Dad, prompting Jake to explain what happened after we left. Jake and Betty took a taxi to the hotel after we left on the bus to the airport. However, they encountered a problem once they were in the taxi. They couldn't communicate well with the driver because neither of them spoke French, and the driver didn't speak English. Despite the driver asking them something, they couldn't understand and ended up getting out of the taxi without realizing Betty was still inside. Jake expressed concern that he couldn't reach Betty on the phone and worried she might have been mugged or faced some other trouble after being left by the taxi. Realizing he needed help and feeling overwhelmed by the situation due to his lack of understanding of French, Jake turned to us for assistance. I reassured him that both my father and I are fluent in French. Despite Betty thinking of my father as incapable due to his age, he used to be a French teacher and I currently teach French. This trip to France was planned by Jake as a way for my father to reminisce about his youth. Upon arriving in France, my father seemed revitalized by memories of his time studying abroad. Since I also had experience studying in France during my student days, after parting ways with my brother and his wife, we shared stories about our time in France. My father listened intently, eventually nodding in understanding. "Let's head back to the city center. I'm guessing the taxi that dropped you off might be waiting for its next passenger there," my father suggested. Following my father's advice, we swiftly prepared ourselves and embarked on a mission to locate Betty, who had been left behind somewhere. My father and I decided to split up and search for the taxi that had dropped off my brother and his wife when they returned to the city center. It's common for taxi drivers in the area to speak French fluently without needing to use English. Before I could reach them, my father managed to find the taxi that had taken Jake and Betty, leading us to the spot where Betty was supposed to have been dropped off. Thankfully, Betty was there, safe but looking weary. However, upon her arrival, it became evident that she had been robbed. All her bags and belongings were missing, leaving her with nothing. When Betty spotted Jake's face, tears started to form in her eyes, but she quickly put on a frown upon seeing us. "Why are they here, Betty?" Jake asked, clearly annoyed, and let out a heavy sigh. "If it wasn't for them, you'd have been stranded here with nothing, Betty. You should be thankful," Jake scolded her. Betty looked uncertain. "What do you mean?" "Without them, our trip would have been a mess. We can't speak French, so that's why we're in this situation." "But they're different. They're both French teachers, much better at it than I am," Jake clarified. Betty seemed uneasy, glancing over at us. A troubling thought crossed my mind, and I quietly told Betty, "If we hadn't found you, you might have had to sleep on the streets here." Betty clenched her lip in frustration. "And besides, Jake and I split the expenses for the trip equally. So how can you say it's all funded by an old lady living off her parents' money?" With that, Betty began to tremble. "It's your father's money anyway, right?" In response to Betty's argument, my father gently shook his head. "I didn't do anything, Lisa. Jake and Betty are doing well on their own. They're my pride and joy." Just as I felt Betty's glare bore into me, she fell silent, refusing to say a single word of thanks despite being helped. I had a lot I wanted to say to her, but my father's whispered advice to take it easy made me restrain myself and stay quiet. This must have been a very embarrassing moment for Betty. She probably never expected to be rescued by someone she had looked down upon. Even Jake seemed tired of Betty's stubborn hostility towards us, his frustration evident on his face. "Well, now that everything's sorted out, shall we continue our sightseeing? Let's go to a restaurant I used to love when I was studying here," my father suggested cheerfully. With my father's optimistic suggestion, our family was united once again. We had a fantastic time in France, ignoring Betty's gloominess and fully enjoying our trip. When we returned to the States, Jake kept apologizing to us and surprisingly decided to divorce Betty. I was shocked and asked him why they had married in the first place. It turned out Betty had lied about being pregnant and pressured Jake into marrying her. After they got married, it became clear that she wasn't pregnant at all. Jake had hesitated to divorce her earlier because of his public image, but he couldn't tolerate Betty's disrespect towards my father and me anymore. After the divorce, Betty was forced out of their home and couldn't continue living as a housewife. Without a maid to help with household chores, she faced difficulties. Additionally, she lost half of her assets due to a pickpocket incident during our trip to France. She must be working hard now to make ends meet. Meanwhile, my father became noticeably happier and more lively, reminiscing about his youth in France during our trip. I decided to quit my teaching job and started a French language school at home. I hope to renovate it soon and have my father join me as a French teacher. "I can't believe you brought homemade pudding." My business partner teased me, expecting fancier desserts. He tossed the pudding in the trash, leaving me speechless. Feeling angry and helpless, I went home. My wife seemed oddly cheerful, promising that the rude man would face consequences. The next day, something surprising happened when I went to meet the president. "My name is Danny Klein, and I've been working in an office for 10 years now. Today, I'm feeling nervous because I have to bring a gift to a tough business partner named Walter Morris. He's picky about gifts, and if he doesn't like yours, he won't even talk to you properly. Sometimes he'll even make up excuses to send you away. But he's important for our business, so I have to deal with him." One day, my manager came to my desk and praised our company's great patented technology. I agreed, but also mentioned how they'd become arrogant because of it. We used to work together closely, but things have changed. My manager looked at me sympathetically. I chuckled bitterly and ran my hand through my hair. "I've heard that the president and his wife are nice people, despite Walter being difficult. I hope things improve soon." "Yeah, things should get better soon. It's tough, but it's all part of the job." "Thanks, I'll give it my best shot," I replied to my manager. But finding the right gift every time is such a hassle. If I get him the same thing again, he accuses me of being lazy, I complained. My manager suggested, You know, the president's wife really likes pudding. Maybe next time you see them, consider getting some pudding. As soon as my manager mentioned it, I thought of a special pudding from a local store. It was incredibly smooth and creamy, just melting in your mouth. It had the perfect balance of richness and sweetness, exactly like the pudding my wife, Lily, makes. Lily runs a small pastry shop from our home, and her puddings are a hit with everyone in the neighborhood. They're so popular that they often sell out by mid-afternoon, loved by both kids and seniors alike. After work, I hurried home to find Lily already in the kitchen, preparing dinner. As I entered, a sweet aroma filled the air, making me smile. Lily greeted me with a cheerful welcome home, humming a tune as she worked. Excitedly, I told her about my conversation with the boss and how his wife loved pudding. "I want to take some as a gift. Can you make some?" I asked eagerly. Lily hesitated for a moment before asking, "Do you think my pudding will be good enough?" I could see a hint of nervousness behind her smile, but it reassured me. Even though Lily makes amazing puddings, making one as a gift for my business partner's wife was understandably stressful for her. Still, she agreed with a nod and said, "Okay." Once dinner was ready, Lily didn't even sit down to eat. Instead, she jumped straight into preparing the pudding for tomorrow, insisting she needed to get it done. "Thank you, Lily." "I'm sorry," I said, feeling grateful but guilty. "It's no problem. I want more people to taste my pudding," Lily replied cheerfully, diving into the preparations. She moved back and forth between the kitchen and her shop, busy with the task. Seeing her determination, I couldn't just stand there watching. I decided to pitch in and help, following Lily's instructions closely. We ended up staying up later than usual, eagerly anticipating the reaction of the boss and his wife the next day. I fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke up to find Lily already awake, her head popping out from the shop, wearing a white apron. "It's ready," she announced, holding a tray of neatly wrapped puddings in her hands. "Thank you, Lily," I expressed my gratitude, not knowing how early she must have woken up to prepare everything. I thanked her repeatedly, feeling appreciative of her effort. Lily, looking a bit bashful, responded, "It didn't take too long because you helped me." As I reminisced about the morning's activities, a smile crept onto my face. I carefully placed the puddings, wrapped in white paper bags with blue ribbons, on the passenger seat and let out a sigh. With renewed confidence, I started the company car. There shouldn't be any problem with Lily's pudding. It's sure to impress. That's what I believed, until I heard a voice that crushed my hopes. "What's this?" Just like always. I mentioned Walter's name to the receptionist with a smile, and she asked me to wait for a moment. Taking a seat in the entrance, I made sure the pudding in the bag was safe. As I waited, I noticed Walter approaching from the elevator, wearing a slight smile. When he glanced at what I was holding, he immediately questioned, "What is this?" with doubt in his voice. I couldn't help but flinch. Nevertheless, I replied calmly, "It's just a small gift. It's pudding made by my wife, who runs a pastry shop." But before I could finish, Walter scoffed, "Pudding? Are you mocking me? Shouldn't you bring something fancier?" His words were filled with disdain, and he looked at me as if he were mocking me. At first, I didn't understand, but as it sank in, I felt my fists clenching in anger. Walter was a client I had been working with smoothly until now. I couldn't afford to ruin our relationship, so I swallowed my emotions and tried to reason with him. "Even though it's not fancy, my wife's puddings are quite popular," I explained, but Walter dismissed it, saying, "No way. I can't eat pudding made by an amateur." He snatched the bag of pudding from my hand roughly, leaving me stunned. "What are you doing?" I exclaimed, taken aback. My anxious voice clashed with Walter's dry laughter, attracting curious glances from the receptionist and other employees passing by. "I can't believe you give me such low-quality stuff," Walter remarked, lifting the bag to his face with a scrutinizing gaze. My anger surged, but I fought to keep my cool. Then I heard him say, "It's the CEO's wife's favorite. Even so, would you bring something made by an amateur?" I defended, feeling the need to stand up for Lily's skill. "My wife is definitely not an amateur. Even so, you must understand that I can't serve such an unsightly pudding to the president." With that, Walter released his grip on the bag, letting it fall into the trash can nearby. It happened so fast that I couldn't react, leaving me standing there in shock. The bag with the pudding inside made a mournful sound as it landed in the bin. A small gasp escaped from the receptionist nearby. "I'll take care of it for you today. Just be more careful next time, Walter stated, his voice dripping with irritation. All I could do was stare at the discarded pudding and mutter a barely audible, I'm sorry. Walter nodded in response, his expression unreadable. Whether he was satisfied with my apology, I couldn't tell. I've got some urgent matters to attend to. I hate to do this, but could you please leave? Without waiting for my response, he turned and headed towards the elevator. I stood there stunned, unable to tear my gaze away from the discarded pudding. Time seemed to blur, and before I knew it, I found myself back in my company car. The memory of Lily's hard work on the pudding weighed heavily on my heart, filling me with a mix of sadness and anger. Most of all, I felt frustrated with myself for not being able to stand up for her or myself. All because Walter was a business partner. I couldn't focus on work that day, my mind consumed with how to tell Lily about what happened. When I got home, Lily greeted me with a smile, casually sipping tea on the couch. Caught off guard, I paused in untying my tie. Did something happen? Lily asked, noticing my hesitation and concern. Unable to hide it any longer, I confessed everything to her. I'm sorry, he threw away the pudding you worked so hard on right in front of me. Lily looked surprised at first, but then she gently squeezed my hand. It's not your fault. Maybe there was something wrong with the pudding. Deep down though, I knew that wasn't true. Walter hadn't even bothered to look inside the bag before tossing it away. It didn't matter what was inside. If it wasn't up to his standards, it was going in the trash. Before I could apologize again, Lily stopped me. She seemed to think for a moment, then grinned mischievously. That man's getting fired. Fired? I questioned, taken aback by Lily's comment. I'm just kidding though, she reassured me with a soft chuckle. Even though it might not have been perfect, it's still disheartening to hear that the pudding I worked so hard on was thrown away. Her reaction was understandable. Anyone would be upset to hear their efforts were disregarded like that, even Lily, who rarely makes such remarks about rude clients. But who knows, it could happen, she added mysteriously, leaving me feeling a bit puzzled. But that was the end of our conversation. Lily urged me to wash up early that night, so I bathed in a mix of confusion and frustration before turning in earlier than usual. The next day, still feeling weighed down by yesterday's events, I headed to work with a heavy heart. My boss had instructed me the day before. I know it's not ideal, but tomorrow you need to buy a cake from the high-end Western confectionery store in front of the station. His words echoed in my mind as I stopped by the pastry shop near the station on my way to work and bought a cake. I placed the box from the fancy pastry shop on the passenger seat, letting out a sigh heavier than the day before. Yesterday, I had promised Walter that I'd come back today with an apology gift. Maybe because of the incident, Walter had responded with an even more arrogant tone. All right, I'm counting on you this time, he said before hanging up. I should get going, I told myself, mustering up some motivation as I settled into the driver's seat of my company car. I drove towards the client's office, determined to make things right. As I entered through the automatic doors, her receptionist who recognized me hurried over. Are you Mr. Klein from Company X? She asked. Yes, that's me, but please, lead the way, I replied. Following her, I stepped into the elevator, and before I knew it, we had arrived at our destination floor. The room I was directed to turned out to be the president's office. The receptionist knocked a few times, and when the door opened, I was ushered in. Inside, I found the president of the client company, his wife, and Walter, all looking uneasy. I had expected Walter to be his usual arrogant self. Especially after yesterday's incident, but I was surprised. Nice to meet you, I'm Danny Klein from Company XX. Thank you for having me here today, I said, puzzled by the situation, as I greeted the president, Mr. Peterson. You must be Danny, pleasure to meet you. I'm Mr. Peterson, and this is my wife, Anne. Mr. Peterson replied, cutting the formalities short. They exchanged glances, then called my name and bowed deeply. We are truly sorry for what happened. Please accept our apologies, Mrs. Peterson added sincerely. I'm sorry, what did you say? I asked, feeling surprised by how the president's tone suddenly changed. His wife, standing beside him, looked shocked too, bowing her head without saying a word. I quickly asked them to lift their heads, but they wouldn't. Then, I noticed Walter, who was standing behind them, also bowing. This was unusual because Walter was usually very proud and never apologized. But there he was, saying sorry with careful words for the first time. I was taken aback and didn't know what to say. Walter continued, "Actually, yesterday my wife found something in the lobby trash while she was cleaning." His wife nodded to confirm. She seemed upset and asked around about it. "She found out that the pudding you brought earlier had been thrown away disrespectfully by someone." We called him to ask, and at first, he denied it, but later he admitted it reluctantly. Mr. Peterson gave Walter a cold look, and Walter seemed to feel it as he bit his lip and looked away. "I didn't know Mrs. Peterson liked pudding. I thought it was from Danny, and I tossed it without thinking." "I'm sorry," Walter said, sounding quieter than usual. I was surprised by Walter's unusual behavior. Mrs. Peterson shook her head firmly. "That's not why I'm upset," she said in an angry tone, breaking her silence. "Danny, I've known about the pudding from Lily's store for a while. I knew it was really popular and always sold out quickly, even though the store was busy. You made the pudding for me. It's disappointing that an employee of a manufacturing company doesn't appreciate the effort put into making a product." I was shocked that Mrs. Peterson knew about Lily's store and understood the emotions behind making something. Walter, looking even more nervous, tried to apologize again, but Mr. Peterson told him to face the person he was apologizing to and lifted his pale face up. "Walter Hooper sincerely apologized to me for carelessly throwing away the handmade gift from your wife yesterday." He faced me directly, bowing his head repeatedly. In that moment, I felt a sense of clarity. When I got home, Lily was sitting on the sofa drinking tea, just like yesterday. Without saying hello, I told her about what had happened today. Lily listened to me without interrupting until I finished. Then she smiled and said, "I thought as much." Her calm demeanor suggested she had expected everything that happened. Lily got up and made a cup of tea for me from the kitchen. As she handed it to me, she began to speak. "Actually, yesterday evening, a man in a suit came to buy our pudding, but we were all out. He mentioned that the wife of his company's CEO loves our pudding. Could it be the president's wife he meant?" "Probably Ann Peterson," Lily said with excitement, nodding happily. "It's amazing to know there are people who appreciate the effort we put into our products. It motivates me to make even better things for them." Lily took a sip of her tea, still smiling. Seeing her so genuinely happy made me understand Mr. and Mrs. Peterson's words better, but it also made me feel guilty. Did I truly value the effort of producers like Lily while doing my job? I was angry at Walter's arrogance, but was it because I thought we were doing him a favor by selling our products? Maybe I was being carried away too. Like Lily, shouldn't I strive to connect the creator's thoughts with the consumers through my work? As I thought about all of this, Lily noticed something and gently placed her hand on my shoulder. "Perhaps from now on, you'll consider both the creators and the users' perspectives." Lily's words made me feel a bit embarrassed, but more importantly, they gave me a new outlook on my job. After everything that happened, Walter's attitude changed a lot. He wasn't as arrogant as before and stopped demanding gifts. Now, we openly share our opinions and have a better relationship. Like Lily, I want to keep delivering the creator's ideas